Welcome to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brianna Griffith, and here's what's going down in your backyard and across the world. This week we are covering the many world, essentially, revolts, rebellions, and protests against neoliberalism across the world. This is going to be the focus of much of our show from here through the end of the year, is the focus on these various forms of revolt against neoliberalism and, broadly speaking, against capitalism, because I think it's so important to understand the global impact of this. To talk about all these, especially a couple different examples of Chile and Iraq, we are joined once again by Walter Smolarek. Thank you, Walter, for coming on the show once again.
Happy to be here.
So let's talk, generally speaking, about the revolt against neoliberalism. Because there are so many different kind of contexts for this. There are so many different kind of economic points and kind of social conditions in which this is happening. What are some of the more generalized statements or generalized trends within this that we can kind of call on right now, that we kind of recognize right now?
Right. I mean, of all the, throughout all the major actions taking place around the world, the rebellions, the uprisings, there are certainly some common issues that we can point to. One, I think this is probably, the broadest one, is inequality, the extreme gap between the rich and the poor, both in terms of, income and also just overall wealth. So, do you live paycheck to paycheck? Are you starting to make ends meet every month, every week, every day? Or do you live in luxury? Do you have, the basics of life guaranteed and all sorts of luxuries on top of that? And I think, since the 2008, world economic crisis, the Great Recession, there's been both additional political attention paid to inequality in society, and also an actual worsening of that gap between the rich and the poor, where, the types of economic activities that working class people engage in, basically like work, right? Like going to your job, wages there, income has been either stagnant or declining. But then the types of economic activities that wealthier people engage in, for instance, owning stock, the stock market in the United States and in many other countries around the world has skyrocketed over that same period. So, the wealth enjoyed by the richest and the suffering endured by the poorest in society have both intensified.
And all of this, we have generally, I think, called neoliberalism as sort of an economic model in many ways. It's the privatization of social services, I think, is what people would recognize that as well as kind of other economic policies that directly benefit, essentially, as we're talking about the quote unquote 1% or the bourgeois class, the business owner class, whatever it is you want to call that. Corporate media here in the U.S. never uses the term neoliberalism. There was actually kind of a point where I think one of the major news outlets, I think it was either New York Times, Washington Post, one of the usual suspects on this, originally posted an article saying something to the effect of Chile is fed up with neoliberalism. And then neoliberalism was stricken from the later headline when it was posted online, essentially. That's not something you see in much of the rest of the world. For instance, as I'm listening to other media in Latin America, Telesur or media out of Cuba or whatnot, it's the idea of neoliberalism is something that's talked about all the time. So I'm wondering, if we can just basically kind of give people what basically is neoliberalism, how it kind of started, and sort of the mythologies versus the reality of what the neoliberal economic model of capitalism really is.
Yeah, well, it's a tricky, phrase formulation because, on the one hand, there's, like the corporate media in the United States, which wants to, pretend like it doesn't exist, the things that we would sort of associate with neoliberalism, privatization, like you said, a stagnation of wages, deindustrialization, the rise of low-wage service sector work as kind of the dominant form of economic activity for the working class. The gutting of the social safety net, all these social services that people used to be able to rely on or partially rely on, getting rid of those. That is just sort of presented in the corporate media as the way things are. By giving it a special name, they don't want to give it a special name because then, well, maybe it doesn't have to be like that. On the other hand, I think, in left-wing circles, everything is neoliberal. You could kind of, apply that label to like anything that's bad, and it kind of loses its specific meaning. So I think that, maybe the most helpful way to understand this concept of neoliberalism is like the dominant model of capitalism that emerged after the 1973 economic crisis. So there are, small recessions, if you want to use that formulation, right? So every 10 years, there are these like cyclical economic crises every 10 or so years. The ruling class, global capitalism, is able to basically just sort of ride them out, right? Like it's, a couple quarters, maybe a year of economic turmoil, and then the business cycle, right? So this is the sort of textbook, like civics class definition of this. So like the business cycle restarts. But every 30 years, there are much more profound crises, and of course, 30 years, that's also approximate, but, every 30 years or so, so there was the long recession, the long depression starting in the 1870s. Then you have, the Great Depression beginning in 1929. And then the big systemic economic crisis after the Great Depression was the 73 crash. And so that was basically the beginning of the deindustrialization of the United States. So after each one of these systemic crises, capitalism has to sort of reinvent itself. It has to go through some kind of fundamental change in like its model of accumulation. Like, how does capital get bigger? How do capitalists get richer? The methodology that they use. So, the Great Depression, for instance, was resolved through World War II, right? The ruling class just destroyed big swaths of the world. And then, the Reconstruction, as well as the, construction of the weapons that carried out that devastation, that proved to be enough of a stimulus to sort of restart global capitalism, to sort of kickstart it and get it back into gear. In 1973, the world economy was transformed so that heavy industry and manufacturing would primarily take place not in the advanced capitalist countries, in the imperialist countries, meaning, approximately like Western Europe, North America, Japan. And instead, those industries would be moved to East Asia and other oppressed parts of the world, other parts of the, formerly colonized world. And then the question becomes, well, okay, so what do we do with all the people and all the stuff that we have inside, our own formal borders, inside the borders of the advanced capitalist countries? The solution that they came up with, quote unquote solution, is low-wage service sector work, right? Which is, tends to be very precarious. You don't know how many hours you're going to be getting. Your job is not secure. You may have, no benefits at all, or maybe just, very paltry, insufficient benefits. And then this is also where the system of mass incarceration came from, because, there just wasn't enough the bourgeoisie couldn't come up with enough tasks for workers in the advanced countries to do anymore once they deindustrialized them. And so parts of working class life, or, what working people had to do to survive, was criminalized. And so the sort of twisted, deranged answer by the capitalist class, by the elites who rule this country, is to lock up, millions of workers in cages. That's another key feature of neoliberalism. Mass incarceration is a form of social control. They also were in a position politically where they could go on the offensive against all the gains that working class people had won over the course of decades and decades and decades of struggle. This is certainly true in the United States, with like the quote unquote end of welfare as we know it, which was perpetrated not by a Republican, but by a Democrat, by Bill Clinton, through the bizarrely, grotesquely named Personal Responsibility and Welfare Opportunity Act, right? Like that's what they called the name of the law, where they, cut off food stamps to, millions of poor kids, or, made working class impoverished mothers, lose some of their benefits, lose most of their benefits. Temporary assistance for needy families was devastated. All of these very important programs are also sort of eliminated as part of the neoliberal model of capitalism.
The largest struggle, or one of the largest struggles at the moment against neoliberalism, is basically happening at what was the epicenter, the ground zero for the kind of neoliberal experiment. That is to say, Chile after the Pinochet coup. It seems that the neoliberal model in many ways has reached kind of a terminal stage there, where it's no longer I say it's no longer kind of feasible, but again, capitalism, as you say, kind of reinvents itself every few decades to find essentially new ways to kind of suppress uprisings, or to kind of deal with these contradictions within it. But nonetheless, it does seem like there's something very, very kind of interesting and very new going on within Chile at the moment, as well as many other places. What sort of is the situation, especially as we're speaking? Today is November 10th, as we're kind of recording this. What sort of gains have the Chilean people been able to make against neoliberalism there?
Well, what's going on in Chile is absolutely amazing. Enormous, huge demonstrations. If your listeners haven't already seen photos or video of some of the biggest crowds, I really encourage you to go check that out. The largest demonstrations in the history of Chile have been happening the last couple of weeks. The largest day of action saw 1.7 million people go into the streets is the estimate I saw, including 1.2 million people in the capital city of Santiago. And the population of Chile is about 18 million. In Santiago, there's about 8 million. So, I mean, that's like, a big percentage, like that's 15% of the city of Santiago going out and participating in this protest. So it's a true uprising of the people. It's originated in a militant action organized by working class high school students. And there was an increase in the fare, it was a modest increase in the fare of the Santiago metro system. But, regardless of the amount that it was just sort of one step too far. The people had clearly reached the breaking point because as a consequence, and we can go into this history maybe a little bit later, but, as a consequence of what you were talking about, the neoliberal model of the Chilean economy, things are very, very expensive there. And so working people have an extremely difficult time making ends meet, especially with the, very miserable salaries that people are forced to subsist on. So this was just one step too far, 4 cents or, $4, like whatever. If you're going to increase the cost of living on this essential social good, right, transportation, we're going to rise up and stop you. And so high school students who are, highly organized, there's the High School Students Federation in Chile, went into the metro stations, propped open the turnstiles, occupied basically the areas where people pay, and opened up the gates and said, hey, come on in, we're not going to pay. As an act of civil disobedience against the high cost of living. And so, thousands of people were participating in this. It sort of captured everybody's imagination. And then that set off the rebellion that's still going strong today, drawing in hundreds of thousands, over 1 million people, on a regular basis. So the Chilean people, I think, have shown that regardless of the concessions that the government is, ready to give, and has given actually, like an increase in the minimum wage, and also a reduction in the hours of the workday too. That's not going to be enough. What the people are demanding is a full overhaul of who has power in society. And basically people want social rights to be enshrined, to be guaranteed, the right to housing, to education, to health, to a dignified retirement. The pension system is privatized in Chile, to basic utilities provided, for a reasonable cost or for free as a right, like transportation, like electricity, like water. Chile is the only country in the world where the water is privately owned.
The entirety of the water is privately owned within Chile?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So that was part of, this neoliberal experiment that began after the coup, like you pointed out, in 1973. So in 1970, Salvador Allende was elected. He represented a coalition called Popular Unity. And Popular Unity was made up of the Socialist Party, which Allende was part of, the Communist Party, and other left-wing formations. Those were sort of like the core components of it. So the Allende government nationalized the copper, supported worker takeovers of big swaths of, the industrial belt of the country. They guaranteed social rights. They basically, their perspective was that through electoral means, right? Electoral means accompanied with struggle in society, with the social movements and political parties associated with Popular Unity. We would be able to basically implement a socialist society sort of bit by bit without like a decisive insurrection. And so it was a heroic attempt. The people gained tremendously from the 3-year Popular Unity government of Salvador Allende. But what ultimately happened is that the ruling class found this experiment to be unacceptable, and they were determined to crush it using the most brutal violence imaginable. And so a coup d'etat was organized by the CIA. This was something that was, masterminded certainly by the Nixon administration. The head of the armed forces, Augusto Pinochet, led a coup. And in addition to capturing the presidential palace, it's people still debate today whether Salvador Allende, committed suicide or was murdered. But Allende died the day of the coup. And then the roundup of leftists, of communists, of other, left-wing revolutionaries began. And estimate, tens of thousands of people were killed. 30,000 is a pretty common estimate, but, just huge numbers of people were rounded up and executed en masse. So that's the political context whereby all of these neoliberal economic policies, these ultra-capitalist, ultra-exploitative economic policies were implemented. It was implemented at the barrel of a gun.
I think one of the things that's interesting and very important for people to note who may be looking for this sort of a social change, not the Pinochet sort of social change, but the Salvador Allende sort of social change, or the other kind of models of like, well, let's take all of the essentially wealth of society and put it toward a kind of more public use. Let's basically take the wealth of society and put it in the hands of the people and allow all of us to sort of benefit freely from what it is that we collectively have built. For anybody who's sort of following that kind of model of a social progress, one of the important things is how do we get there? And so one of the things we saw with Allende and with a lot of the pink tide is much later, the kind of Latin American pink tide that emerged after Hugo Chavez and whatnot, is essentially that there is a difference between the elected government and the state. That is to say that kind of the politicians who are elected to kind of serve as a legislative or the executive branch of the government versus the actual kind of deeper structures of a capitalist state, which exists essentially as sort of a stopgap to prevent this sort of thing from going all the way, to prevent a kind of radical social shift like that. So, for instance, right now, as we're kind of speaking, the question of a possible coup attempt to overthrow the Bolivian government is certainly on everybody's minds. It does seem that there is a very obvious coup attempt within Bolivia, largely kind of led, of course, by the U.S. That seeks to overthrow the Bolivian government and undo all of the similar sort of social gains and economic gains that the Bolivian government made, but also by the Bolivian police forces and whatnot. Much of the Bolivian police have essentially joined in on this coup, and it remains to be seen what the Bolivian military does. So one of the things that for those people who are pursuing that electoral route, to really be thinking about is if you are elected, or if your candidate gets elected, if your party gets elected, et cetera, how do you protect those gains against this more deeply entrenched system? I mean, we have the most, in the United States, we have the most oppressive, repressive national security apparatuses that have ever existed in human history. You look at the FBI, you look at the CIA, the Pentagon, which has 1,000 military bases across the world, essentially, that exist to prop prop up, $1 trillion and more dollars a year, not including the billions of dollars of local city budgets and whatnot for police force. All of this to prop up essentially this capitalist state. So when you were talking about neoliberalism, in many ways, we're talking about that essentially violent enforcement of this quote unquote free market system. But anyway, like that sort of question I think is real important of like, how do you protect those gains when electorally you can see what happens when a socialist gets elected? The state kind of goes into full gear to undermine, to neutralize, or even to assassinate those kind of socialist leaders. So then another model or another kind of way of establishing sort of a people's power is necessary. One of the things I think that's characterized kind of the latest era of popular uprisings has been this kind of like spontaneous uprising model that we saw, for instance, after 2008. We saw it kind of with different groups here like Occupy Wall Street or the Black Lives Matter movement. We saw it abroad with what I guess can broadly be called the Arab Spring, but like this sort of popular uprising that is largely quote unquote decentralized. And what we saw with that is, largely kind of failures due to in many ways, a lack of leadership capacity. This idea of like the kind of idealistic, quote unquote, horizontal model that the Occupy people want to use simply led to lack of clarity in demands. It led to kind of a lack of ability to respond to the threats that arose to the Occupy movement. So it was easily crushed, for instance. Looking now at kind of these new uprisings that are emerging, what sort of can we say about essentially what people have learned from that? How are people moving forward in kind of a more organized way that will not simply lead to, the kind of reestablishment of that same capitalist state power?
Sure. I mean, we've seen, to go back to Chile, the force of the state on full display, because immediately after the demonstrations began, after those civil disobedience actions took place outside metro stations in Santiago, the government of the right-wing billionaire Sebastián Piñera called the military out onto the streets. He declared a state of emergency, which meant that, the actual sort of like formal armed forces, so not the cops, but like the troops, would go out into the streets to patrol and repress demonstrations. And that came along with a curfew, something that harkens back to the days of the Pinochet dictatorship. For basically the entirety of the Pinochet regime, you couldn't go out at night past a certain point. There was a permanent curfew in place to prevent people from organizing, from fighting back, from, to just keep like an iron grip over society. And so that all was brought back. That was brought back within like a day or two. And so, nobody elects the head of the armed forces, right? Nobody elects the generals. People don't really elect the head of the police forces either. There's this permanent professional staff that's dedicated to maintaining the power and wealth of the people who already have power and wealth, who, we would call the capitalist class. And the most important part of this professional staff are those who are trained in and have the legal authority to carry out violence against other people in society. So the police, the army, the courts, the prisons. This is sort of the backbone of the state. But, there are also other professional counter-revolutionaries, you would call them, professional maintainers of the status quo in the bureaucracy of, every department of the government, whether that deals with foreign policy or labor policy or social programs. There's this professional full-time staff of people who are dedicated to maintaining the system, and it's called the state. There's a government in countries that have, the bourgeois democratic form of government, a constitution with periodic elections. Governments can come and go, and some of those governments can have left-wing orientations, right, and do important things to advance the struggle and to ameliorate the suffering of working people. But that at a certain point, sooner or later, will come into sharp conflict with the existing state apparatus, which in the case of countries like Chile and also in Bolivia and Venezuela and most of the world, that status quo is backed up by U.S. imperialism, or one of U.S. imperialism's junior partners. So people are dealing not just with their own domestic ruling class, but with sort of the full force of the most powerful ruling classes, the most powerful capitalist classes in the world. So it's a tremendous struggle. And the question is, how can people win in a battle with an apparatus that's that strong? And I think the answer, and this is, the answer that revolutionaries in the socialist movement have sort of developed over the course of, a couple centuries of struggle against the capitalist system, is that a party is necessary. A party is necessary to act as a counterweight to the state. And a political party, a revolutionary party, is composed of cadre, of professional revolutionaries who make the organization of the revolution, preparation for a revolutionary situation, the main priority in their life. Just like the police, just like the generals, just like the prison wardens make the main focus in their life the preservation of the status quo. So that, I think, is something that, many people, a conclusion that many people who are participating in these demonstrations are coming to. I think that revolutionary parties are growing in the countries that have been, struck by this wave of mass protest. But that trend needs to consolidate. That trend needs to become, strengthened, so that when these spontaneous uprisings happen, right, and all these uprisings across the world, it caught people by surprise. Like there was, after the fact, you could say, oh yeah, all these conditions were in place, but nobody saw this coming. And spontaneous demonstrations like this, like the Arab Spring, like you mentioned, like the Occupy movement, they'll happen periodically. It's just it's a law of society. When there's an oppressive order, people will protest. But the question is, will these protests lead to the consolidation, the sharpening of the implements, the tools, the weapons that the people need to defeat a system, to defeat a class whose power is entrenched by a state?
If you are just tuning in, you are listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic is broadcast on a KOOP 91.7 FM Austin and WHIV 102.3 FM New Orleans. We are also available as a podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are potted. We are speaking for the full hour with Walter Smolarek. We are talking about the kind of wave of protests against neoliberalism and capitalism that have rocked the world in the past month, a little over a month, I think, at this point. One of the important things to kind of recognize that affects so much of geopolitics today is that the U.S. Is always kind of hedging its bets against trying to make sure that, like, even when there is kind of an uprising, even when there is kind of a revolutionary moment, that somebody with some sort of non-socialist leaning is able to kind of take power there. I think a good example would be the Iranian Revolution, where the U.S. Essentially tried to ensure in the kind of last moments of the Shah that the very strong at that point Iranian Communist Party was unable to consolidate those gains, and then instead went to what they believe to be a kind of more controllable theocratic government, even if that government still remains hostile to the U.S. Like the prospect of kind of an international socialist solidarity is something the U.S. is always trying to hedge against. So I'm wondering generally, like with regard to the fact that that Chile has suffered under almost half a century of essentially this kind of capitalist, hyper-capitalist, neoliberal dictatorship. What sort of do the forces on the ground kind of look like with regard to just general progressivism, leftism, and the possibility that this does actually lead to kind of a socialist revolution there?
The left-wing parties in Chile were, very, very strong, of course, prior to the coup. There's the Popular Unity government. There's sort of constituent parts of that. The Communist Party was very strong back then and is still strong today. They have several members of parliament. They get substantial numbers of votes. They control some municipal governments as well. They're also the leading force in the CUT, which is the main trade union federation in Chile. The Socialist Party, which was Allende's party, still exists. It's important, but it's become much, much more moderate over the years. Revolutionaries in Chile, of course, are still struggling to overcome that historic defeat of 1973 and the fascist regime that ruled the country until 1990, where all of these left institutions were made illegal. They were crushed. Leaders were killed or sent into exile or tortured in the most horrific manner. So the left is in a lot of ways still, of course, grappling to overcome that historic defeat. But there's lots of reason to be hopeful, I think. I mean, there's in addition to the legacy, right, of that era, and in addition to popular unity, we should also mention the revolutionary left movement, which it's more commonly referred to by its Spanish acronym, the MIR. The MIR was, also a very powerful revolutionary movement that existed that was supportive of Allende and supported Allende against the right wing, but was not actually part of the government, was not part of the popular unity coalition, because they believed that a revolution would have to take place, that the old state would have to be smashed and a new socialist state representing the interests of workers and the oppressed built in its place. So they kind of had a particular strategic orientation. So all of that legacy is still very much present in the minds of the people. Victor Jara, who was a communist, very, very famous communist folk singer from that period, his songs are like the anthem of the demonstrations. They're played everywhere. People remember this period. And then in addition to, the organizations that were able to survive, like the Communist Party, there are very powerful social movements. So there's the Confederation of Students of Chile, right? So in 2011, there is this really big strike that shut down the entire country's higher education system for 5 months. That took place around the same time as the Occupy movement, the Arab Spring, and it was really like a big international deal. They're still participating, of course, in these actions. There's the high school students who started the rebellion with the fare evasion civil disobedience action. The workers, have been going on strike, calling general strikes, and also calling sort of open assemblies, like people's assemblies, to debate the way forward. And then there's also, a new left formation that's emerged in the last few years called the Broad Front. And the Broad Front is a coalition of many different groups, but, the core of it sort of came out of the leadership of that 2011 student strike. And, some of the leaders of that movement who are not already cadre of the Communist Party. And they really had a breakthrough election campaign the last cycle when Piñera was elected. So their candidate, Beatriz Sanchez, came very, very close to making it into the second round of the election. So there's one round where everybody runs, and then the top two candidates, if nobody won a majority, go on to a second round. So they almost got into that second round. Instead, it was unfortunately the much more moderate sort of center left, like bourgeois liberal candidate who didn't really inspire the people, and so lost to Piñera in the election. But they're out in the streets. Their candidate. I was just looking at some opinion polls yesterday. It's very early, but their candidate is the most popular in a lot of those polls. So there's a lot of left wing forces in existence in Chile who are gaining power. But it remains to be seen if there'll be a serious effort put together to organize, like an insurrection, right? Because that's an extremely complicated question. I mean, it's more than just knowing that there has to be one and wanting there to be one. It's also a calculation you have to make about can we survive? Or is our economy capable of withstanding the blockade that will surely be imposed on it by world imperialism? Can we deal with, the possible military consequences of seizing power? It's something it's the most complex question.
In focusing on all of these and focusing on kind of the broader revolts against neoliberalism, I'd like to now kind of connect to Iraq, where there have also been kind of major protests going on around the same time. I have not followed the government of Iraq very closely. I've just kind of understood generally that the government of Iraq kind of post Saddam Hussein has essentially been in many ways kind of a U.S. puppet and whatnot, that the U.S. essentially stripped away all pretenses of kind of the normal regime change, humanitarian industrial complex of kind of this, providing humanitarian aid to like this or that rebel force that then overthrows the government. No, and in Iraq, that was all stripped away. And like the U.S. just directly overthrew the Iraqi government, just directly invaded and essentially tried to turn Iraq into a puppet government, into a base where the U.S. could use for essentially broader Middle East regime change operations. But that kind of failed for a very long time. It seemed that Iraq was kind of destined to be, in some ways, kind of a weak puppet government and then a failed state. But it now seems that there have been kind of turns there as well. Maybe you can talk a little bit about just generally like what's been going on in Iraq since kind of the U.S. invasion generally.
Yeah, well, the goal of the U.S. invasion was to overthrow a government that was independent of U.S. imperialism. I mean, whatever other political assessment you want to make of the Ba'athist government of Saddam Hussein, it was outside of the control of U.S. imperialism, and to replace it with a government that would be firmly and reliably in control of the U.S. government. And then, you're absolutely right. The plan was to make that kind of the jumping off point for this wave of regime change operations to get rid of independent nationalist governments all across the Middle East. And then, the idea being that this would form the cornerstone of, the new American century. The U.S. won the Cold War, U.S. imperialism won the Cold War. And then by securing the world's energy resources, which are, concentrated in the Middle East, they would be able to rule the world. I mean, it's unbelievable to even say this, but this is the way that they thought they would be sort of have unquestioned sway over the world for the foreseeable future. And so what they didn't calculate is that the Iraqi people resisted, they fought back, they defended the independence of their country. And so the government that was created, right, the United States, basically, the mythology is that there was, the surge in 2007. And, because the United States sent an additional, few divisions of soldiers into Iraq, they sort of valiantly put down the uprising, and then the United States was able to withdraw, having stabilized, quote unquote, stabilized the country. That's not what actually happened. The United States knew that it was defeated in Iraq. It was defeated by the Iraqi resistance. It would never, end the insurgency. And so they essentially paid a faction of the resistance to stop fighting them. The chaos that was created by the U.S. divide and conquer tactics to control Iraq led to this horrific civil war. That's basically where ISIS came from. At that point, it was just called the Islamic State of Iraq, not the Islamic State writ large. But basically, the United States started paying many of the resistance fighters from the Sunni Arab part of the population to instead fight al-Qaeda, who is carrying out these horrific terrorist attacks. And so, because there was this momentary lull in the fighting in some ways against the U.S. occupation, they were able to basically engineer the beginning of a phased withdrawal that culminated in 2011. Now, Obama didn't actually want to leave Iraq, right? The idea was always to leave a residual force of, thousands of U.S. troops there. But the Iraqi government refused to sign an agreement that would basically give U.S. personnel there, U.S. troops, total immunity from Iraqi law, which is, of course, something that's very important to the Iraqi people when you consider just the unbelievable atrocities committed by occupation forces in their country since the invasion began in 2003. So then the question, why would the Iraqi government refuse to sign that? If they were just a puppet government, if they were set up, and indeed, the Iraqi government was set up by the occupation forces. And that's because the United States was too weak. They were too weak to assert control over the entire country. And so even some of these political forces and even the same individuals who owed their initial, taste of power to the U.S. occupation, that their calculations shifted, the balance of power in society shifted. And so the Iraqi government started to assert a pretty great degree of independence or autonomy, at least from the United States. And so, the Iraqi government is deeply divided. Certain sections of it are, more sympathetic to U.S. imperialism. Other sections of it are, very opposed to that, and are in fact sort of ideologically inspired by the current Iranian government. There's like the guardianship of the jurist, like theocratic model of government that people support. And so that is also, a major political force in the government right now. And yeah, it's very, very complex. But basically, the war, the occupation did not go as the United States wanted it to. And now Iraqi politics sort of it's its own world. It's not just this, narrow, tightly controlled arena that the United States wanted. It's very, very complex.
Yeah, everything we kind of hear about generally the Middle East, the Arab world, as well as the broader Middle East, is kind of funneled through this kind of lens of either being kind of within a U.S. sphere, which also includes like Saudi Arabia or Israel, or the other thing we always hear about is the growing quote unquote Iranian influence. And whatnot, that is supposed to be the great boogeyman that justifies in many ways the U.S. Occupation force forever. But as you're saying, that there's truly so much politically going on with that's absolutely beyond that framework, and even that framework is so skewed in itself. What sort of is the class character generally kind of the Iraqi government, and sort of what has kind of sparked these protests in particular?
Sure. So the Iraqi government is controlled by this complex coalition alliance of convenience. And the reason for that is the sectarian system of government imposed on the country by the U.S. occupation. So this is, classic colonial divide and conquer strategy, whereby in the new government, in a constitution written under the tutelage of the United States, there's and this is more of an informal arrangement, but it's clearly the way the government works. The prime minister is Shiite Arab. The speaker of the parliament is a Sunni Arab, and the president of the country is a Kurd. And so for this reason, politics are kind of organized along sectarian lines because, depending on your own, imposed sectarian identity, you're kind of only eligible for one of these three top posts. And so, there tends to be Shiite parties, Sunni parties, and Kurdish parties. And then they kind of have to make deals amongst themselves to share power. So this has resulted in a situation. So the prime minister, Adel Abdul Mahdi, who is basically the outgoing prime minister at this point, he said that he'll resign as soon as a successor can be found, and then a new election law can be passed, so that there can be sort of emergency elections called to resolve the crisis. He said he's out, but he basically came to power through an alliance between one Shiite bloc, which is perceived as being close to Iran. They support the guiding ideology of the Iranian government, which is something that has adherents in other parts of the Middle East. And then there's another faction that's led by Muqtada al-Sadr. And Muqtada al-Sadr was a resistance leader during the U.S. occupation, a very infamous one if you watch the U.S. media during that period. But he's somebody who is, has like an Iraqi nationalist orientation. He's opposes both U.S. influence and also is hostile to Iranian influence in Iraq, which is, certainly real and something that people resent out of a sense of sort of, national pride and a desire for self-determination. It's ridiculous to draw an equal sign between Iranian activities in Iraq and U.S. activities in Iraq. I mean, the United States killed like 1 million people. I mean, over 1 million people, actually, according to the Lancet Medical Journal, by just, invading Iraq and shredding the social fabric of the country. Iran has not done anything of the sort. But certainly there are political forces in Iraq that are loyal to Iran, and that, causes some discontent. And so that alliance, right, between al-Sadr and, the pro-Iranian Shiite political forces has, it was a very uncomfortable and awkward alliance to begin with, but that's kind of the nature of the Iraqi political system. So that produced Adel Abdul Mahdi, who's considered to be, not a U.S. puppet, I guess you could say. And then, there's the president, Barham Saleh, who comes from the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan political party, which is one of the two sort of traditionally ruling Kurdish parties that, are secular and has, at least nominally like a center-left orientation. And then there are various Sunni parties, and, the Sunni political forces are especially in disarray because it was basically the majority Sunni parts of Iraq that were occupied by ISIS. And so, the liberation of those parts of the country from ISIS happened, just like a year or two ago. People are still traumatized, shocked. Society, is in tatters, and so it's been more difficult for people from that sector of society to participate in this latest uprising. But certainly there's discontent with the status quo there as well. All of these political forces have, I think, some kind of, you could say, bourgeois political orientation, right? Like they're not opponents of the capitalist system by any stretch of the imagination. Although the Iraqi Communist Party is quite strong, it has a couple of members of parliament, and they actually withdrew from the parliament. They resigned their seats in solidarity with the protest movement, and they are part of the alliance led by Muqtada al-Sadr. And they're hostile to sectarianism. They're one of the few political parties represented in parliament, or up until their action and protest. That it's non-sectarian, right? An all Iraq political party, and one that, of course, is an advocate of socialism.
At one point, kind of Iraq did have a socialist leaning pre-Saddam Hussein, who, of course, was put in largely by CIA, largely by U.S. forces. What sort of are the prospects for kind of a more kind of a socialist leaning or anti-capitalist revolution within Iraq generally?
Well, you're definitely right about the historic strength of the left in Iraq. So after the monarchy was overthrown, which was, allied with British imperialism, which was, the colonial rulers of Iraq, basically between the breakup of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I and then, the wave of decolonization that followed. There was a historic revolution in the late 1950s. It, terrified the United States. And it led to the presidency of General Qassim, who was a left-wing Arab nationalist, anti-imperialist, who had a lot of similarities and was inspired to a great degree, by the government of Egypt, by the government of Gamal Abdel Nasser. And General Qassim ruled in coalition with the Iraqi Communist Party. The Iraqi Communist Party was sort of at the height of its power in this period in, late 50s, early 60s, had, many, like hundreds of thousands of members, millions of supporters all throughout society. But there was a coup against General Qassim, and then a new political force came to power, and that was Baathism. And, even though Baathism was bitterly in Iraq, was, bitterly anti-communist, overthrew this progressive anti-imperialist government. It too was basically another left-wing political force that, portrayed itself as a left-wing anti-colonial, anti-imperialist political force. I mean, the motto of Baathism is unity, liberty, socialism. And for, certainly there are all sorts of deficiencies. Like Baathism is not socialism as you and I would understand it. It's not the rule of the proletariat or the working class. But, it just shows that like the default of Iraqi politics is not this sort of like religious sectarianism. That's not at all the natural state of society there. That's kind of, the racist myth that was fed to the United States population, especially during the war, during the most intense period of the U.S. war on Iraq, where it was just like, oh, well, look, these people have just been fighting each other forever. Not true. Completely not true. Sectarianism was something that was, inflamed and made a central part of Iraqi politics by U.S. colonial intervention. I mean, I think that the Communist Party, it seems like they've been gaining strength over the past couple of years as discontent with, neoliberalism, with inequality, and especially with corruption. In Iraq, I think corruption has, really taken center stage because when you think about it, it's kind of a backdoor form of privatization, right? Like there are certain government services that all people, all citizens of the state are entitled to just by virtue of being an Iraqi. You should be able to get certain public services from civil servants. But, when you effectively have to pay a bribe to those civil servants in order to receive the services that you're entitled to, isn't that kind of like privatization? You have to pay for something that once was free. And so that's become, is a central part of the rebellion there. And in Iraq, we should note that, it's been by far the deadliest. Over 250 people have been murdered by quote unquote security forces. So whether that's police, whether that's militia members, basically armed opponents of the protesters, have shot people, and these are like snipers too, right? This isn't like you get injured and then in the hospital a few days later you die from your wounds, even though that's of course happening too. People are being shot in the chest, people are being shot in the head. This is a brutal campaign of deadly repression and murder. So I think the fact that people are still protesting despite all of this like super intense deadly repression, like that's one lesson, if you want to call it, to learn, just to be inspired by the unbelievable heroism of the Iraqi people demonstrated yet again in the face of violent repression. The left has a big challenge in front of it to overcome sectarianism. It's similar to the challenge faced by the Lebanese Communist Party and other progressive and left-wing political forces in Lebanon. But the rebellion kind of has that promise. I mean, it's so intense, it's so historic, that there's a lot of hope that this could be kind of a serious blow, if not a death blow, dealt to this imposed sectarian system that's been dominant in Iraqi politics for the past 16 years.
Normally, we see these kind of large international protests in times of severe economic downfall. So when a recession hits, usually, for instance, the last kind of wave of these major kind of global protests was after the 2008 recession. At this point, the recession, it is clearly very close. We are clearly on the cusp of a major economic downturn, but generally that hasn't really hit yet. So I wonder what the implications for that are. Essentially, like, how will kind of the coming global recession that we're already starting to see the cusp of, how will that sort of affect these kind of waves of protests that are already in motion, do you think?
Well, sure. I mean, there's kind of a few like essential ingredients for a revolution, right? And one is a revolutionary crisis, a situation in society where the ruling class can no longer go on ruling in the old way, and the oppressed refuse to go on being ruled in the old way, right? So, something has to give on one side or another. The old order cannot continue. It sort of hit a wall, and some type of fundamental change, whether that's reactionary or progressive, has to take place. And these kinds of revolutionary crises generally take place as a consequence of either economic crisis or as a consequence of war, or both. It is a pretty remarkable fact that these demonstrations are taking place, which aren't quite insurrections yet, but really are truly intense and have the potential to really overthrow the status quo. They're taking place in a period where there's not like an acute economic crisis. Like, economic conditions are bad, like the misery that people are suffering is intense. But it's not sort of like it's not like a shock, like the 2008 crisis was like a big shock to the system. And it's, generally not taking place in the context of like a hostile, like an invasion or like, a war that turns, a not in favor of the existing government. So, this is, a spontaneous wave of protest that seems to have global dimensions, and, any other external shock certainly has the potential to intensify it.
I think all of that is truly important. So I think that's a pretty good place to wrap it up, unless you have kind of any general sort of last thoughts of kind of what the American left can kind of look at this and kind of glean as sort of for like basically what kind of lessons can we learn from what's unfolding now, as far as like what is necessary for a revolution to happen, for like a better future to kind of be born out of this.
Well, number one is to take to the streets to protest. Don't accept the status quo. Don't accept the injustice, the oppression, the exploitation that you're subjected to as natural. It's not natural. It's not normal. It's not the preordained way that society should run. It's unjust, and you have a right to fight back, to rebel against it. That's what the people of Chile, of Ecuador, of Lebanon, of Iraq, and so many other countries are demonstrating right now. The other thing is that, the U.S., along with, local elites, are going to move in to crush these uprisings and to crush any progress made by the left. In Latin America, there's a progressive counteroffensive against the far right that's underway, and the right wing is fighting back with all of its might. And right now, I think everybody needs to be paying attention to Bolivia. There's a coup d'etat attempt underway. We'll see how it develops in the coming days and hours, but certainly the United States has some kind of role in it. And I think that progressive people here in the United States need to demand that the U.S. government keeps its hands off of Bolivia and stop trying to overthrow yet another progressive, democratically elected leader and implement a dictatorship, which is what they want, a dictatorship of the cops, perhaps of the military, of the old ruling elite. So, I think that's sort of the last thing I want to say is that, all eyes should be on Bolivia, and we need to be prepared to mobilize in solidarity.
Absolutely. That's a great place to leave it. We're going to go ahead and wrap up. We were joined for the entirety of this episode by Walter Smolarek. Thank you very much, Walter, for coming back on the show once again.
Thank you very much.
That's all we have for this week. You have been listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates in Austin, Texas, and is also available as a podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX for more news and analysis. We are out of here.